Okay, students, I want you to take a look at this and ask yourself, what is this an image of? Is it a candle holder with a black background? Or is it two faces with a white background? The answer is, it's both. It can't be one without the other. And that is the concept behind negative space. Negative space is one of those really useful tools I use all the time to sort of help make sure that my drawings are correct. It's a way of taking your mind and making it look at things correctly and using your right brain to sort of analyze the space that's in front of you. The truth is when you take information from the three-dimensional world and you plug it into your your paper, a two-dimensional surface, everything fits together like puzzle pieces. That candle holder would not exist if it wasn't for the two dark faces behind it, and the two faces wouldn't exist if it wasn't a candle holder between them. So let's take a look at some other objects that have negative space. A chair is a great example, like an open chair. Each one of these spaces in between these openings are enclosed negative spaces. Here's one that's very specifically like a long triangle. Over here we have kind of a tooth shape. Here's just, I don't know what to call this, but your mind can see it. It's a large, defining, significant shape. The concept behind using negative space is that this chair can be completely drawn if all you drew were these shapes that are in between, the shapes that are around the chair. So you could draw the entire chair just by drawing these shapes. Out here you have what's called open negative spaces. They're the ones that kind of go off the page and they sort of go off into the void. You're sort of skating along the outer edge of the chair versus the shape of the void itself. But regardless of how you're doing it or which kind of negative space that you're doing, enclosed or open, you're looking at the spaces between, and that is what you're drawing. So let's see how this can affect your work. So this is a piece that's been done by sort of a novice drawing student. They haven't been taught the concept of negative space yet, and they were asked to draw the projector on a wheeled cart. And you can see the projector is a little wonky. It doesn't look like they're really using sighting techniques either. Um, this is wonky. The electrical cord just looks like, essentially has no mass. It just looks like a line. And the wheels, they're just all horizontal on the page, which is a very left brain sort of symbolic thing to do. Your mind makes these assumptions and it's like, well, the wheels are flat on the ground, so they should be horizontal on the page. But that doesn't take into account the way like linear space works or anything like that. So the same student, now after being taught negative space, has drawn the same cart, same projector, and it's much more believable. It works much better. And it's really just a way of making your brain work differently and more efficiently. Sorry, I get my pointer. So here, they just probably using sighting techniques to get the angles correct and perhaps the dimensions, but then drew this sort of modified looking rectangular shape. Another one here, another one here. Cruising down the edge of this chord, like a slow contour drawing, but just an observation of these shapes that are in between. And then out here, you have these open negative spaces. And the artist sort of follows along the lines, observing how it cuts underneath this overhang very specifically, doing almost like a slow contour observation of that shape, giving you the correct placement of the projector itself. So here's some student pieces, and these were done in the classroom. Here we had an easel. It had some, extension cord sort of wrapped around it. And their task was, without using any drawing of the subject itself, without drawing the easel, but only drawing the negative spaces, they were able to come up with this very, believable and correct looking representation of the subject. They were asked to draw just the negative spaces, only focusing on those openings. And then what you're left with is this nice sort of white silhouette of the object itself. We went a step further, and as you will, we're going to take either construction paper or I like to use newspaper personally to fill into the negative spaces just by cutting different pieces and sort of tucking them in to the spaces around. Here's one that was done with newspaper, and you kind of see how that works. I believe it gives you sort of an elegant contrast between the white and the background. And I think the way the letters run, they remind me of a mark making. Like they remind me of drawing, like hatching. And so it builds up this sort of visual gray that makes a nice contrast. Another one from the classroom. These pieces can be cut, they can be torn. It's up to you how you want to manage cutting up the actual construction paper to fit into the background. Each of them will give you different looks. Now here we have one that has a nice white border. And for this assignment, I'm going to actually show you how to make a border which does two things. It, for one, makes it look more professional. It gives you sort of like a framed look, but effectively it actually shrinks the working space too. So rather than having to try to fill up the entire page, you can make your working space a little bit smaller while making it look more professional at the same time. Sort of ties everything together and makes it look good. One thing I do want you to notice, I'll talk about this again, but notice at the bottom of the page that this distance from here to here is thicker than the distance here, here, and on the right side. That's called a weighted border. And we'll get into that when I do the demo. But I'll ask you to do the same thing. It's just a trick that artists use to sort of make their drawing look like it's not sagging on the wall. Another one, another chair. The one thing I will say about chairs, even though they look very simple, as they are, I mean, they are sort of like a simple construction, there's a lot to consider when you're doing something like that. There's lots of siding that will be involved. You'll have to measure carefully, using your pencil as a protractor, figuring out the different angles, the way the chair sort of leans back, how the back legs sort of lean back, but also at the same time taking into account the way things lay in space because of two-point perspective. You'll have to take a lot of careful measurements for these things to look right. Mapping, for example, laying your pencil on the bottom of this leg versus this leg to see how the leading leg is further down in space and the subsequent legs recede backwards like that. And one more student example of a similar sort of situation, a chair and an easel. This time they just filled it in with charcoal. It gives a good contrast. However, we're going to go ahead and we're going to use something else. Now this works not just for man-made looking geometric objects, but it actually works really good for organic shapes, things like foliage. If you look at these leaves, there was a very careful study by the artist of the negative spaces that go between. Almost like a slow contour drawing observation of the shapes that are made in between each one of these leaves, which, of course, once you've drawn those, where they go, make the leaves themselves. And this is actually a very smart way of doing it. Oftentimes, if people try to accomplish or take on the task of drawing branches or leaves or things like that out in nature, if they're not aware of negative space, it doesn't look right. There's something off. Take this branch, for example, and it has these forked branches. The artist was very aware of that space in between. Whether they gestured it first or did a slow contour, whatever they did, they got that shape to look correct, therefore putting the branches themselves in the proper place. It's amazing how much better it looks and how more realistic it is if you're using this process. I know for myself, whenever I do a drawing and something does not look right, this is my number one go-to. I go to looking at negative space. I force myself to reimagine the space. I look at the spaces between the objects I'm trying to draw, and 9 times out of 10, this is what will tell me what is wrong with my drawing, because I'll see one of those negative spaces is off. One of those shapes is incorrect. Here's from another artist's work. She would go out into, like her garden or backyard and grab some leaves or whatever and sort of bring them in, just let them fall on the table as being, and then do studies of them. And if you look closely, you can see the little remnants of gestures, which I'm going to show you is probably the smartest way to start your drawing, just as a way to get an idea of how your composition should look, right? Notice how this is a very nice open composition. The leaves touch the edges of the page is being filled 80% or more. It really fills up. But once they have that gesture in place, that artist went in and did a very slow observational contour drawing of the negative spaces, making them very specific, therefore making the leaves very specific. The positive space will only look right if the negative space looks right as well. And again, one more piece that's a little bit more finished. Just to kind of describe how this fits itself into like a more finished drawing. This is a positive and negative space drawing. Just up here, like the negative space has been modulated with charcoal. The values have been made darker, so the positive shapes of the plants and stuff kind of come forward. And then as you cascade down the page, the negative spaces have been left blank, and the positive spaces have been shaded and rendered in value.